So now we will jump to the last speaker of the morning. She's Katrina Ingram, the founder of Ethically Aligned AI, Data Analytics, and Ethics Advisor for the city of Edmonton in Alberta. She will talk about AI plus EDI, so I guess it's a phonetic, nice set of acronyms, and shaping the future for all. Katrina, thank you for coming and be here. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Ricardo. Just give me 1 second here. I'm just going to start my timer so I can stay on time. Yes, and this is a nice segue that you left off on. I'm just going to pick up on this idea of the word everyone. How do we make a future that's suitable and shaped for everyone? And I think inclusion is a really big piece of that. And so here's a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes. So there's this idea that those who make a technology get to shape a technology, and there's a body of work that supports that idea. AI, unfortunately, has not been a very inclusive space. And so if we want to get to this bigger future, this idea of responsible AI, I think we need to take an EDI-centric approach to get there. So let me start by taking you back to December of 2018. So in Montreal, there was a G7 summit being held on December 6th, and it was all about AI and inclusion. And there's this lovely quote that comes out of this summit, and it really paints this beautiful picture of responsible AI, a future where AI is used to the benefit of everyone. And it also warns against some harms that might happen if we exclude certain vulnerable populations, that we amplify prejudices. And it basically issues this warning that we can't do that. We need to make sure that in a democratic society, we're using this technology for good and to benefit everyone. So this is taking place at the G7 summit. And this G7 summit was being held as part of a larger event. So it was no accident that it was taking place on this date. In fact, the organizers had planned it this way because they knew that this really important AI conference was going to be in town that week in Montreal. And this is a conference that had been around for over 30 years. It was a place where the who's who of AI would gather. It was an academic conference, and there's a number of these global academic AI conferences that are really important in the field. But what was interesting about this particular conference at this particular moment in time is a conversation that the community within AI, the conference community, was grappling with. It was having a little bit of an existential crisis around this issue of inclusion. So what had been happening is that for at least a year, perhaps longer than that, there had been allegations of misconduct, sexual harassment. Women felt unwelcome. They felt unsafe at these conferences. There was a frat boy type culture that was going on at these conferences. And this had been raised to the conference board and the organizers. And they wound up doing a survey and looking into this. And sure enough, they found that this was the tip of the iceberg. There were other issues in addition to sexism. There was ageism, racism, and a bunch of other issues that were happening. And things really came to a head with this conference in particular because of the acronym, because of the name of the conference, which is a very, sexist and unwelcoming name for certain groups of people. And so this is what happened, is that through this work, and in particular, a protest that was started by a researcher named Anima Anand Kumar, the name of the conference was eventually changed, but it didn't change easily. There was a number of people at the conference, and remember, this is a conference that had been around for decades, for 30 years. They were in the community and they felt, I don't really see a problem. Why is this a problem? Why is this a big deal? They didn't really understand what the issues were. And I would say that's because of who they were. And I want to talk a little bit more about who makes AI. So there's this idea that who makes a technology shapes a technology. And this is supported by a large body of work that I don't have time to get into, but I'll just cite one small example. Langdon Winner did a very famous paper in the 1980s talking about do artifacts have politics? So artifacts such as technological things that are designed, are they informed with a politics? And the answer was yes, they are. And so when we think about how does a technology get informed with a value system, with a political slant to it, with some kind of values built into it, we can think about the people who get to shape that technology. and how either explicitly or implicitly their values inform what is actually made. And so if we take a closer look at who has shaped AI, what we see is a field that is very male dominated. There's a certain kind of technical background. It's mostly white or Asian men primarily. It's people of a higher education and a similar socioeconomic background. And so you can kind of look at this and go, it's a little bit of a monoculture. When you have a monoculture, there's always the risk that the blinders are on and you're not able to see things from different perspectives. And so that is something that I think the field has grappled with. And I think one of the things that led to that toxic kind of AI conference culture that was happening, and that unfortunately also creeps into the technologies that are built. So that was part of the issue. The other piece that I want to highlight is who funds AI typically. And so in the early days of AI, a lot of the funding came from military sources. There's a really famous story about Marvin Minsky saying he never had to write a grant application because his MIT lab was so flush with cash from military sources. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case today, but there are a lot of ties to big tech. And again, these things aren't necessarily overt agenda settings. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're a lot more subtle than that. And they can shape the kinds of questions that are answered or the kinds of questions that are not answered, and also how we answer those questions. So that's a little bit of the challenge with the field and historically where it's come from. And I want to say that I don't think this is just an AI problem. So one of the things I always talk about when I do talks about responsible AI or AI ethics, which by the way, I'm using interchangeably today, I talk about this issue of power. I really think this is core to what's going on. It's about who has power and who doesn't in a system, and how do we rebalance that power dynamic. And so this is a data set I love to show when I'm doing talks about how does historical bias get encoded in a data set. So this is a small data set. We can take it in at a glance and we can see what the issues are. We can see that this is a data set made up of primarily white men. There's only one female on this slide. And if we were to look into the socioeconomic or class backgrounds of who these people are, I think we'd see a certain type of person who gets to hold this kind of power. And this is a similar dynamic to what I've been explaining was going on in the field of AI. And so now we can turn to this issue of responsible AI, AI ethics, and think about who's sounding the alarm. So if we think about the work that's being done, especially the pioneering work that's being done in this field, in this topic of responsible AI, the group of people doing that work look quite a bit different than the group of people who are building the technology. So in this field, we see a lot of women. I would say disproportionately over-indexed with women. When I think about the who's who of responsible AI and who's actually doing the work, there are a lot of women in this field. There's a lot more diversity in terms of BIPOC communities, LGBTQ2 communities, and people who have not just technical backgrounds. So as Kansu was talking about, people from the social sciences, the humanities, the journalists and lawyers, people from a wide range of backgrounds are coming to this field alongside the data scientists and the computer scientists to do this work. I still think this field skews fairly academic at the moment, and I think that's something that we can look at broadening. And I think events like today help to do that work, where we're calling upon industry groups to take part in this discussion about responsible AI and share their practices. So we're moving the work beyond academia. And I also think we can do some more work to move the work beyond just people who are of a certain class. So we talk a lot about these vulnerable communities that are being impacted. Well, those communities also deserve a seat at the table, a stake. They deserve to be engaged and part of the process. And so I think there's opportunity to kind of broaden that out and include more people into these discussions. And in terms of including more people in these discussions, I just want to push on this just a little bit, be a little bit more provocative in how we think about this area of AI ethics or responsible AI, and kind of step out to maybe a more global picture of how this work is moving forward. And so in many of the communities that I'm part of on a global basis, I still do see that the global north tends to set the agenda. So I see a lot of representation from the US, the UK, Europe, Canada to a lesser extent. But who's not part of that conversation? I think that's always an important question to ask when you're thinking about working in the world of inclusion. And we don't necessarily see as much representation from the global south, from Africa, from Asian countries. And if AI is really going to be inclusive for everyone, we need to make sure that we're having a global conversation about responsible AI. I've already talked about academia and the need to move beyond academia, but I also want to add big tech into the mix, because I think big tech can sometimes dominate the agenda as well. And I see a huge role for industry to play, especially SMEs, small businesses, mid-sized organizations who are outside of the technology sphere but are going to be using these tools. I think all of those groups have a role to play in advancing this work. Alongside community groups, civil society organizations, and government. So overall, I think more non-tech stakeholders need to be part of this conversation. And I was able to hang out on Friday night with a really cool group of people here in Alberta. They have a club. They're just a community group that wants to learn more about AI. So they formed a club and they invite speakers to come and talk about different topics. And so I was able to give a talk on Friday, and we had a really great conversation about responsible AI and AI ethics. And they had some fantastic questions. And that's the kind of thing I think needs to happen more in a democratic society, is inviting people who are outside the inner circle into these conversations. I also think that the conversation has been dominated by a Western-centric perspective on ethics. And to a certain extent, that seems normal because, again, the global north seems to be setting the agenda. And so we're having these conversations and it's all new and we need to start somewhere. But I don't think we should leave it there. I think it's really important that we push ourselves to learn more about and include different perspectives. So what are Indigenous perspectives when it comes to this work? What about Eastern philosophies? What about Pan-African perspectives? I think there's a lot that we can learn and bring to the conversation to really include a wider range of voices at the table. In terms of what is considered an ethical issue, I think that's another area that we can broaden things out, and we can talk about things like the environment. Is that an AI ethics issue? Some people say yes, when we think about all the electricity and all the resources needed to have an always-on AI-enabled kind of system in place. What about the gig economy and all the people who label data sets, all the people who do content moderation? They're part of these bigger systems as well, platform workers. And so we can think about AI issues as being a lot more broad than maybe some of the narrow focus that we tend to have on issues such as bias and fairness and justice, which, don't get me wrong, are very important issues. So to sum that up, what I'm trying to say is that I believe responsible AI is more than debiasing data sets. I believe that that is an important issue. It's one that sometimes gets too much focus or can get too much attention, but to me, it's not the whole conversation. Instead, I think about issues of power and how we can shift power in a system. And this quote really speaks to me on that point, not asking about if AI is good or fair, but asking about how power is being shifted in a system. And so with that question in mind, I just want to take a closer look at this issue of EDI and AI. So when I think about how will equity, diversity, and inclusion shift power in the field of AI in terms of who gets to build these technologies, first of all, I do think that this group of stakeholders has a lot to say about mitigating harmful impacts. Again, having a group of diverse people look at a problem and come at it from different angles is going to result in reducing harms and impacts, especially from vulnerable communities, if you're consulting with them and bringing them on board as stakeholders. However, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I feel like that's table stakes. I feel like that's the basics. What I think a more diverse set of creators will do is they will see new problems to solve. And so again, this goes back to the perspectives of who gets to set an agenda, who decides what problems are worthy of solving. And I think that increasing diversity and inclusion in this field is going to allow us to see things in a new way and see new problems to solve. And tied to that point is this next point about having different values and being informed to solve those problems in a new way. So I'll just give you a quick example about that. When we think about how data collection has been done in the world of AI, there's been this sense that we can just be very extractive. We'll just go out to the internet, we'll scrape the internet, we'll get a bunch of training examples, we'll train our model, and that's okay to do that. Well, a diverse set of creators might have different values and different perspectives, and they might say that's actually not okay to do that. We're going to do things quite differently. And so that's what I mean by having a different way of actually doing the work. So we'll have different problems that we're going to solve, a different way of doing the work. And that's all leading to this next point about who gets to shape the future and what kind of future we're going to create. And Ruha Benjamin, who is a sociologist who does work in the field of AI ethics, wrote a great book called Race After Technology. And she talks about this idea of a very small set of people getting to set the direction of the future, and then the rest of us all have to live within it. And that got me really thinking about the metaverse and the idea of the metaverse. And I'm sitting here going, you know, I didn't really ask for the metaverse to become a thing, and yet it's all over the place, and we're talking about the metaverse. And you can see that this is very much agenda setting from a particular perspective. A particular group of incentives are tied to it. But is that the future that we want? I don't know. Maybe it is. But in a democratic society, we need to have the conversation about it and make the decision together. And that's the part that hasn't really happened yet. So in all of that, I think that industry, again, can play a really important role. And in particular, SMEs, small businesses, other sectors outside of big tech, I think they have a really important role to support that diversity, equity, inclusion that we need to really shift power and shift the distribution of power in AI. All right, so that's a lot of background about where we've come from. I want to end this talk and this last part of the talk on this idea of the heroes that we need, and actually want to celebrate some of the heroes that we have, some of the fantastic people who've been doing this work already. And I want to start out with our very own Bethany Edmonds. So Bethany is the reason that we're here today. She started CascadAI. She's doing fantastic work as a professor at Northeastern, leading the charge, developing courses, training the next generation. So one of the great female leaders in this field. And Bethany's part of this bigger group of people. And I'm so fortunate to have the pleasure of being part of this wonderful community of women in AI ethics. And there's some really amazing people who were pioneers in this field, people like Kathy O'Neill, people like Joy Buolamwini, people like Sophia Noble, people who've literally written books about AI ethics and responsible AI. And I want to call out one person in particular, and that's Dr. Timnit Gebru. Dr. Gebru was named one of Time's top 100 most influential people for 2022. And she is doing some really amazing work since her departure from Google, launching an independent research institute and just advancing the charge of responsible AI, AI ethics, and really focusing her work on some areas that don't necessarily get a lot of attention. She's doing a lot of work in Africa. These are some of the books and resources that have shaped my thinking on this topic and that I recommend to others who are interested. And many of them were written by those women that you saw on that prior slide. I also want to give a big shout out to Michael and Caroline Runningwolf. I was actually supposed to co-present today with Michael, and unfortunately we weren't able to make that happen due to some circumstances. But Michael's doing some fantastic work in launching Indigenous in AI, and Caroline is doing her PhD. She's an anthropologist working out of the University of British Columbia, and they are doing work using NLP models to preserve languages in their culture. And it really ties also very well to this next piece of work I want to highlight, which is a set of articles by the journalist Karen Howe. So Karen writes for MIT Technology Review, and she's done this fantastic set of articles recently about anti-colonialism, decolonizing AI. I really love everything that she does, but this particular piece of work really spoke to me. And it's about a community in New Zealand, Maori community, that's, again, using natural language processing to help preserve a language. So it's really community-led, and this project it takes the community values, especially how data is collected and used and who owns data and so forth, and is really using those to inform how the project is done. So those are some of my heroes when it comes to this field of responsible AI. And just to wrap up, I'll just let you know a little bit more about me. So you can find out more about my work at ethicallyalignedai.com. I have built Canada's first AI ethics micro-credential, and my aim is to bring some turnkey training solutions to organizations. And I regularly blog and host a podcast about a whole range of issues, and I'm happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. But right now, I do have time for some questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see everybody, and then I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Katrina. Very interesting talk, and thank you for highlighting the work of other North System people like Bethany and Michael Running-Wolf. And I will say that you cannot even debias data. We are only mitigating bias. So it's even worse than that. Yeah. So we will take 5 minutes from the break to answer some questions. So please, the first question. So okay, you can read it now, Katrina.
Okay, here we go. So Q1. How can we teach for or incentivize men and women, men and people of other privileged identities to consider different perspectives, transforming the, hey, it should be fine mentality to, okay, let me look into this? Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it really speaks to the need for cultural change and how do we implement cultural change? It's not an easy thing to do. One of the things that I've been doing in my own journey around EDI is taking a look at tools like the Power and Privilege Wheel. And that's a tool that if you've done any training in EDI, you might be familiar with, but it really just, you answer a bunch of questions and you sort of see where you land on this wheel. And it's great having that kind of visualization to go, oh, I really do have a lot of privileges. So I think that's the start of something like that, is sort of bringing awareness to the topic, training, and then implementing as many incentives as you can in terms of the process in your organization to make sure people are guided into doing the right thing. It's not easy work. It is not easy work to do. It takes time and effort. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea and answers some of your question.
So the second question is, can we expect the technical community to understand and appreciate the collective socioeconomic psyche and how the regional cultural biases factor in as well? Maybe even customizing the AI technologies that are being developed.
Yeah, well, I think this is, to the extent that we can have interdisciplinary collaborations, I think there's a really fantastic opportunity to be able to do some of that work, because the fact of the matter is, you know, we're going to be experts on one thing, but not everything. And I think part of it is having an openness to hearing from other people, hearing from other perspectives, and then being able to take that into the project and kind of own that as a team. So, you know, can we expect technical people to understand and appreciate? I think so. I mean, I'm hopeful that we can help them understand and appreciate. I don't expect that technical people are going to be the ones grappling with these issues. And I think that's what Kansu is getting at as well, is that, you know, there needs to be other people, ethicists like Kansu, who are the ones who are grappling with those issues, but are brought in as part of the team to work together with the technical people.
Right. So the next question is, for academics who wants to contribute to the work you are doing, what could that look like in a practical sense? So what do you want from academics?
What do I want from academics? So one of the things that strikes me about academia is you have no shortage of knowledge, but what the challenge is knowledge mobilization. So it's taking all of the amazing theories, the papers, all of these things that when you think about industry and how busy people are in industry, they have time to read the high-level summary and then they want to apply something right away. In academia, it's about doing the thorough literature review and knowing, you know, everything. And so how do you take that and parse that into something that can be applied in industry or in government or in a community setting? How do you bridge that? And that's what I'm hoping to do. And so what I would look for from academics is help to do that, help to take the amazing wealth of knowledge that you have and make it applied.
So the last question we have is where there are alternative funds come from to pull the industry away from dependency on big tech and military budgets?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. I think that, I'm thinking a lot about alternative business models. I'm really interested in business models. My undergraduate's in business. And so I think about things like cooperatives, for example. What's the role of a cooperative? Is there something that we can learn from? Could we scale that? What would that look like? Can we fund technology companies in a different way? We have a very particular way of doing that right now with VC funding, accelerators, and 10xing things. Does it need to be that way? I don't know. Like maybe there are other ways of doing things that can pull at the business model a little bit and challenge things. But it's not my area of expertise, but those are just some ideas.
Well, great. And I guess we have some NGOs or nonprofit foundations, especially for families that now are giving money to these causes. But of course, it's not the same amount of funding that you get from big tech and military funding. So thank you, Katrina, for your participation. This is a great way to finish the first session. And remember, we are coming back in 27 minutes for the second session in the afternoon, where we will have many industry talks coming from Canal.
Thank you.